Okay, so, hey, how you doing? Let's talk about the Miami Dolphins, because they're such a funny franchise to me. Because of all their historic success they had in the 1970s, they're thought of as a pretty damn respected NFL franchise. But in the last 20 years, this team has quite literally been the least successful team in the entire NFL. People talk about the Jets not making the playoffs since 2010, but the fucking Dolphins haven't won a playoff game in 25 years. I wasn't even a concept as a human being the last time they won. But before that drought even began, one man carried the franchise on his back from being completely irrelevant. If Dan Marino didn't exist, the Dolphins would be talked about with the likes of the Browns to this day. I truly believe that. Marino quite literally was a modern quarterback sent back in time to lay waste to all NFL records available. He, for my money, is one of the biggest anomalies in all of sports. And with this gift, the Miami Dolphins, for near 20 years, took this generational talent and completely wasted him in every way imaginable, creating this sinkhole they're still in to this very moment in time. So, let's do it together, huh? Let's explore all the factors that came together to explain how a team could possibly waste, arguably, the greatest quarterback of all time in such a way that's still plaguing them to this day. So without further ado, let's get into the video. Daniel, buddy, take a seat, huh? This is about to get painful. And Miami fans, all 6 of you out there, first of all, why? And second of all, I'm warning you, this one's gonna hurt. Because honestly, for how awful it's been being a Raider fan my whole life, pure misery arguably isn't as bad as the pain that comes from wasted potential. And that's where we'll start, because in the 1983 NFL Draft, one of the most stacked drafts in NFL history, John Elway, Jim Kelly, Eric Dickerson, Bruce Matthews, Darrell Green, Richard Dent, and Dan Marino was in this draft as well. But he wasn't drafted as high as his peers because of that dank he was sniffing, allegedly. The man liked to party, and with this being the 80s, where people did more coke than exercise, NFL teams didn't love that Dan Marino was into the drug scene, potentially. I'll keep saying that. With the Steelers, who really looked like they would take Marino because Terry Bradshaw was more of a sediment rock than a quarterback, and Marino had been born and raised in Pittsburgh, even going to college there too. But Chuck Noll, the head coach at the time, said they didn't take him because drugs scary, basically. The Dolphins, though, sat with the 27th pick out of 28 teams that were in the league back then because they just made the damn Super Bowl and rightfully thought they had no chance taking Marino. So they didn't even interview him or meet him at all, but all of a sudden at pick 27, he was available. And they also added wide receiver Mark Clayton in the 8th round to add to sophomore Mark Duper, which were two elite weapons to work with. So, of course, they took the young gunslinger, and even in his rookie year, he had one of the greatest rookie campaigns of all time. Marino wasn't even supposed to play at all in his first year, because remember, this team was trying to win now, and they gave the starting job to quarterback David Woodley, and to set the tone in week 1, David, he threw for 22 passes total and 40 yards. So, after this grand performance, which was one of the worst in the league that year, in just week 1, shout out to Scott Brunner for doing worse, going 10 for 35 with 4 picks, but Don Shula went home, defiled an entire bottle of Don Julio, and decided to stick with David Woodley for just a bit longer. Because eventually he realized that chronic alcoholism could not hide the physical pain he was experiencing while watching Woodley, because he somehow managed only 1 game in 5 starts with a passer rating of over 58. To put that into context, David Woodley's second best game this season as a starter was statistically worse than every game Lamar Jackson has played since November of 2021. Yeah, that's a thing. That was kind of mean. I'm sorry, David, but Woodley then got benched, and, well, Dan Marino never let him get the job back again, and there was a bit of a difference between the two players. After a 12-0 loss to Buffalo in week 1, as with David Woodley's Herculean performance we talked about earlier, netting them 26 passing yards on that day, they didn't do well. But in this week 6 rematch, they had 335 net passing yards. Not a bad difference at all, but the Dolphins would fall just short to Jim Kelly's soon-to-be Bills. Kelly wasn't the quarterback yet, but the Bills would turn into the Dolphins' greatest, I don't even want to say rival, because it was more like a dog and a chew toy situation, but they did not like each other in the coming years. But the new era in Miami had arrived, and it wasn't an era, it was a man. And his name was Daniel Constantine Marino Jr. I feel like that name reminds me of someone almost. But anyway, great debut, and the hype was real. Because remember, this team was just in the Super Bowl a few months ago, and the defense still had pieces like Doug Betters and Bob Bobhauer. They allowed the fewest points in the league. They had a great O-line, with arguably the greatest center of all time in Dwight Stevenson. They had the most respected coach in football in Don Shula, and Dan Marino was the engine of all of this now. And the scariest part was, Marino was getting better and better as the year went on. He struggled versus the Patriots in week 11, but before that, he had 5 straight weeks of domination. And after that, he dropped 37 plus points in back-to-back weeks, commanding the Dolphins offense, with an average passer rating of 120 and a total point differential of 30.5. They won their games by 30 on average in that small sample size, to be fair, as he led the AFC in passer rating and became the first rookie to ever lead the conference in passing yards. And, also, he missed the final 2 games of the season while resting because they already clinched their playoff spot and the Dolphins held their nuke in the back pocket, waiting to drop it. But let's talk about what I think is one of the biggest misconceptions in sports, okay? Any chance you get in the playoffs, I don't care how young you are as a team, any chance is one that you have to take advantage of. Like when the young Green Bay Packers choked versus the 49ers a few years back, that was not we'll get them next time. We're young, we'll get plenty of chances, okay? No, that was devastating. And in this divisional round game versus the heavy underdog Seattle Seahawks, that game was just like that. Yes, the team was young, but a missed opportunity is still a missed opportunity, and boy golly was this a choke and a half. I mean, Matt Ryan wasn't born yet, but I'm sure he was smiling in the sperm sack somewhere, because this Dolphins team could have easily won the Super Bowl. But versus a Seattle defense, who allowed the 3rd most passing yards in the league that year, they just couldn't return to form for some reason. Marino started slow, but eventually got things going, and they even held a 13-7 lead at halftime. Sounds good, right? And yeah, it was. And after forcing a punt on the opening drive in the 3rd, the Dolphins fumbled on a normal run play, which led to a Seattle touchdown. What a terrible play by Dan Marino. He should have willed him to not fumble. Now, that wasn't his fault, but he did throw a pick late in the 3rd quarter, which was rough. And they had a great chance to go win the game themselves later, and they actually took it. A pick led to a Dolphins touchdown, only for Seattle to answer again, and in the final minutes, we had ourselves a shoot. 24! Okay, well, that's brutal, but at least they held Seattle to just a field goal, which honestly, all things considered, is pretty impressive, given how gassed the defense must have been, because they were just out there, and, at least they're going to get the ball back with 1:20 and 3 timeouts.
Ran it to his own man. Fumble!
They fumbled again. Bitch-ass Fulton Walker. 2 fumbles on 2 kickoffs in a row in the most important game of the year. Are you fucking kidding me? And he came back the next season. Brutal. Just brutal in every sense of the word. Marino didn't even play bad enough to lose the game, and he didn't even get a chance to fight back later, too. But now, the ground shook. The gods felt a sense of unrest. Something was rumbling from below, and whatever spirit was pissed off with the league itself fused into Dan Marino's soul and created the most impressive season that will ever take place by any quarterback in NFL history. 1984 Dan Marino is the greatest quarterbacking season in NFL history. It just is, and I'm sure you've heard that before, but allow me to convince you if you are unaware. So the 1980s and football as a whole to this point was a game built around men pounding each other. It was played on the ground, and although the league was shifting more towards the pass with Bill Walsh on the West Coast offense and the innovations by guys like Sid Gillman in years prior, the average passing yards per game by all teams in 1983 was about 200 yards per game, roughly. So, just keep that in mind for the future. Week 1, September 2nd, 1984. Redskins versus Dolphins. Washington came in as the defending NFC champions. They just had one of the best offenses of all time. They went 14-2, had the MVP of the league in Joe Theismann, and are still thought of today as possibly the best team to ever lose a Super Bowl, and they were even hungrier than ever before. But hunger wasn't even close to enough to contain 1984 Dan Marino. 21 for 28, 311 yards, 5 touchdowns, 0 picks, and a 150.4 passer rating in week 1. He had a 100 passer rating better than the reigning MVP, and this was his first full season as a starter. For weeks 1 through 8, he then averaged 298 yards per game, 3 touchdowns, 0.6 picks, and a 120.9 passer rating. These are MVP numbers today, but back then these numbers were beyond alien. Oh, and by the way, the Dolphins were undefeated during that time period. He was breaking the way football was played, and the pass was becoming not only a weapon, but the most effective way to win in the modern age. And by year's end, Dan Marino had 362 completions, new NFL record. 5,084 passing yards, new NFL record. 48 passing touchdowns, new NFL record. 317 yards per game, new NFL record. And he did all of this while leading the NFL in passer rating. He had the greatest volume in NFL history by any quarterback ever, while also being the most efficient man on the planet. Look me in the eyes and tell me that this isn't the most impressive thing you've ever heard from any quarterback ever, okay? And guess what? If you scale his stats up to modern times, according to one Redditor, scaled to 2016 era, Marino would have put up near 6,000 yards per game and 54 touchdowns at least. And God forbid we scale this to 2025 with the extra game added too. All right, let's breathe, y'all, okay? Daniel was a talented individual, is the takeaway here. And he was the face of the team as the youngest MVP in NFL history at the time, at the age of 23. But, I mean, this Dolphins team was also great too. They went 14-2. Elite defense still. Elite O-line. No run game, which surely won't be an issue. But if they were a dangerous team last season, going into the 1984 playoffs, they were a world-ending destructive threat, and Dan Marino was a fucking lava-breathing dragon that had no desire other than to leave the world beneath his feet in nothing but mere waste. But legends are made in the playoffs, and this team had a great shot at somehow being better than the 72 or 73 Dolphins if they got the job done. This was the best team Dan Marino will probably ever have, and they needed to capitalize, and so far they did. The divisional round was a rematch with Seattle, who drastically improved and won 12 games, but it didn't matter. In the third quarter, Dan Marino just blew them up, going 6 for 7, 82 yards and 2 touchdowns. And it was a blowout by then too. And in his first ever AFC Championship appearance after that, a game that's often too big of a moment for young quarterbacks, I don't know, man. I can't say it any better, honestly. The Steelers were good that day. They just weren't Dan Marino good. Yeah, this was his hometown team, man, and he showed them what they missed, as versus the Steelers, he went for 421 yards and 4 touchdowns. That's just the most passing yards in any AFC Championship game since the merger by fucking 100 to that point. And the most passing touchdowns as well, just for the road. This shit is fucking gross, man. It's disgusting. Like, I can't stress this enough. The Dolphins had a chance in the Super Bowl to become the most dominant offense in the history of the sport that will never be touched. If Marino went for like 500 yards and 5 touchdowns or some wild shit like that, he probably would have just been elected president on the spot. But that did not happen because sadly there was a team that was better. 49ers versus Dolphins was the Super Bowl, and for how great the Dolphins were, the Niners were better and favored. They had Super Bowl DNA, an all-time great defense, with an all-time great offense as well, as they went 15-1 with the best point differential by any Niners team ever. And this is the paradox of greatness in sports. No matter how great you are as an individual, so often you just can't do everything yourself, and especially in the NFL, as after a hot start, the Dolphins ran out of gas. During the first possession of the game for San Francisco, they didn't do much, but after that, the Dolphins allowed a Niners touchdown on 4 of their next 5 possessions, and yeah, that was it. The Dolphins were forced to play catch-up versus the league's best defense, attempting just 8 runs all day, and that was it. The Niners switched to man-to-man and just out-talented them, and the immortal Dan Marino was defeated as an underdog. But he knew he'd be back, and in his defeat, he earned the respect of his opponents, as even Ronnie Lott commented on what he saw in a young Dan Marino. The guy just had it. What it isn't exactly quantifiable by stats, but Mahomes has it. Brady had it, and Dan Marino definitely had it. And the plan from here on out was simply make it back to a Super Bowl. And that did not happen. Spoilers, I know, but welcome everyone, especially fans of the Miami Dolphins, to the painful part of the video. So let's begin the downfall and how Miami wasted this all-time great legend. Remember how the Dolphins had an elite defense? No, that was gone now. The big loss going into 1985 was the retirement of linebacker A.J. Dewey, who was damn near the entire defensive scheme, and without him and other injuries, the defense started out slow and finished slow all around, giving up the 6th most yards per game in the league, with the only 5 teams allowing more, all being below 500, and besides the Chargers, they all didn't win more than 5 games. So, nice. Dan had to work with that, and this run game. Boy, was his run game something unique, as in 1985, their leading rusher was Tony Nathan with 667. Fucking awesome. More on this later again. But I'm being negative because, well, yeah, everything around Marino was rotting, but Dan Marino was a fucking superstar again. He was the best quarterback in football in the regular season. He had a statement win where he single-handedly picked apart the Bears defense, preventing the 72 Dolphins' undefeated record from being broken, while making the best defense of all time look like the 2024 Panthers. But the playoff disappointment would only just begin, because for the first time, Dan Marino did not have a good postseason. Versus the Browns in the divisional round, I mean, they were getting fucking destroyed. It was 3-21 in the mid-third quarter, but then Marino revived the offense out of nowhere and led them to 3 straight touchdowns, and they barely escaped. But the next week, they weren't so lucky. They had chances. They should have won, honestly, but they just didn't take those shots, and this one was kind of on Marino. The Dolphins finished with 6 total turnovers, got destroyed in the time of possession battle, and in games like these, if you can't run the ball, you can't win, as the Patriots outrushed them by near 200 yards, and thus had 20 more minutes of possessing the football, and won the game, ending the Dolphins' 18-game home winning streak, while preventing a Bears vs. Dolphins Super Bowl rematch, which would have been perfect for entertainment. So okay, they fell short, but the front office had clear goals to accomplish: a run game and a better defense. And, you know, to their credit, they did at least a pretty good job of doing that in this year, as they drafted linebacker John Offerdahl, who would go on to become a 5-time Pro Bowler and All-Pro, and running back Lorenzo Hampton seemed to be developing into a solid back. No, he wasn't. But in 1986, the defense sucked. The old stars from the 70s were gone. The pass rush was atrocious. They allowed 6,050 yards, the 2nd most rushing yards, the 7th most passing yards. They genuinely did not have a single strength. And I don't know what else to say, but you are not winning anything with that formula. Joe Burrow knows that too. But, this is why it hurts so much, because again, Dan Marino had a historic season, and the league's best offense was in Miami as well. And from 1984 to 1986, in his first 3 years in the league, he still to this day had the greatest first 3 seasons at quarterback that any player has ever had and likely will ever have. Like, this is not okay. Fuck the NFL. If he kept this up, we're talking about the greatest athlete in sports. It's just, I have no words. In this 3-year stretch, he made 3 first-team All-Pros, won 34 games, had the first-ranked offense in 84 and 86, with it being 4th in 85, not that bad either, won the 1984 MVP, led the league in passing yards and passing touchdowns for all 3 seasons. And I mean, look at this graphic. These are the first 3 seasons of starting quarterbacks: John Elway, Jim Kelly, Joe Montana, and Dan Marino. You might have heard of them, and it's not even fucking close. He's like doubling them in terms of everything. He threw 122 touchdowns in his first 3 full seasons. Fucking Mahomes didn't even come close to that record. And they missed the playoffs. The Miami Dolphins did not make the playoffs in 1986. The defense was that bad. Dan Marino fucking tried. He really did. But it didn't matter, because to start the year, the Dolphins were 1-4. And if you ignore their 1 win versus the worst team in football in the Colts, through week 5, the Miami Dolphins defense, a professional organization, was giving up 41.5 points per game. Dan Marino dropped 45 in week 3, and they lost. Another Joe Burrow moment. Am I right? Sweet mercy, though, bro. I can't do this. I'm going to blow a fuse, and I'm not even a Dolphins fan. I don't care, but this just angers me. And in 1987, the wheels were really starting to fall off, because center Dwight Stevenson suffered a career-ending injury, and that was the end of the only Hall of Famer that Dan Marino ever played with. Now, the other issue was overall the Dolphins were not drafting well too. They had some guys here and there, but in this pre-free agency period, if you didn't draft well, you were just kind of cooked, and that was catching up with them. As with teams like the 49ers, Bills, and soon the Cowboys drafting well, the Dolphins were falling behind rapidly. Now, I will give the 87 season a pass. Okay, it was a strike-shortened season. Things were weird. Fine, whatever. But 1988, the Dolphins went 6-10. This was the worst record Don Shula had ever had as a coach, and the narrative was beginning to change, and in the worst way possible. The Dolphins were officially wasting Dan Marino. There was criticism for Marino, with some saying the NFL was gearing against stopping the pass because his numbers weren't as obscene, and it was all on him, but some of that's true, I guess, but lower stats does not always mean he's playing worse. Marino, though, was actually just being wasted, and even Dan was beginning to feel that way, even hinting at possibly leaving after his contract was up, which was unheard of back in the day, pre-player empowerment era. And you'll never guess what the fucking problem was. They had a bottom 5 defense and a bottom 1 run game. Lorenzo Hampton was not that guy, and he led the team with 414 rushing yards. 400! Led the team, and they were just not even trying to run the ball either, forcing Marino to air it out over and over again. Because A, they didn't have a run game at all. The guys were not talented. B, the O-line was deteriorating, and Marino was naturally amazing at avoiding sacks. And C, they were allowing fucking 30 points a game and always had to play from behind anyways. And in 1989, the formula failed again. But this time, Marino struggled even more as his receivers, Mark Clayton and Mark Duper, were now beginning to show their age, approaching their early 30s, and someone else was showing their age too. It wasn't Dan, but it was Don. Don Shula was not the great coach he once was. It sucks, but it happens to every great coach. I mean, even recently we saw it happen with Belichick. The Dolphins showed him blind loyalty, but the game had begun to pass him by a bit. But finally in 1989, he took a bit of a backseat in play calling and allowed Gary Stevens, the new offensive coordinator, to add some fresh intelligence to the squad. In 90, Dan Marino was playing a different brand of football. It was weird. He had like the least completions and pass attempts in any 16-game season he's ever played, the least passing yards and touchdowns, but also the least interceptions. And the Dolphins went 12-4, leaning on the defense and playing efficient football. Just a wild flip-flop from the rest of the last 8 years, but it was working. And in the wild card, we got Chiefs versus Dolphins, a classic game that continued to cement Dan Marino as a legend. Down 3-16 in the fourth, with a lifeless offense, Marino engineered a meticulous touchdown drive to go down just 6. And then again, starting at his own 15, he went the length of the field and found Mark Clayton for what would become the game-winning touchdown after a missed field goal too. And this was their first playoff win since 1985, which was a drought back then. But, this is where the villain is introduced, as the Buffalo Bills took them on in the divisional round, and traveling to Buffalo was a death sentence for teams. It still usually is, and man, the Dolphins just took like everything they've sucked at for the last couple of seasons and executed their fuck-ups perfectly in this game. The first drive for Buffalo had 2 fumbles, which they recovered both of, and the Dolphins gave up a touchdown, then another, then another, then another, then another, then another. I mean, you get it. Marino played well, man. He really did. He showed he could revert to being a gunslinger if needed, even pushing 30, as although he had 2 picks, the first one was a deflection, and the second was an arm punt that actually gave them field position. And I mean, this was an elite Bills defense. It's just, you know, even if you put up 34 points, it doesn't fucking matter when your defense allows 44 points and crumbles completely. I don't know what's even going on anymore. I hate seeing the argument where people are like, hey, Dan Marino didn't always have bad defenses. I mean, look at 1990. But like, bro, yes, the defense was good on paper, but they still allowed 44 points in the playoffs. Like, what more do you even want from Dan Marino? You want him to play strong safety? Jesus, man. All right, well, 1991 was more regression, and this was just not a great time to watch this team play football. By 1992, they had another very good team, and by this point, it literally was Dan Marino and nobody else. Like, this might be his 4th most impressive year ever, which doesn't sound like a jarring statement, but given how outlandish 84 through 86 was, it actually is. So in 1992, Dan Marino led the league in passing yards again, and yards per game, while also being top 8 in completion percentage, yards per attempt, and interception percentage. So, why is this impressive? Well, the Marx brothers were fossils by now, and his top receiver on the team in terms of receptions was his running back, Bobby Humphrey, with 54. Sick. At least they had something resembling a run game with Mark Higgs, who almost ran for 1,000 yards. Oh, you dirty boy, really? 1,000, crazy. Still, he does not have a 1,000-yard rusher. He's never played with one, and his defense was, pretty okay to goodish, but some thought this team was a dark horse Super Bowl contender, despite the flaws. They had a really tough schedule to end the year, and Dan Marino can do all, right? Nope. No, he can't. Well, he can, sometimes, but he can't overcome everything, as although they throttled the Chargers in the divisional round, again, they had to travel to Buffalo, and this time the whole team just blew dick. It wasn't even one thing to blame. Marino sucked, the run game didn't exist, the receivers couldn't catch, no defense, just a pitiful performance, and the Dolphins didn't even score their first touchdown until garbage time. And that was kinda their last great shot. It's only been a decade at this point in the video, but Dan Marino was really running out of time. And in 1993, they never even had a chance. Not only did Don Shula say he didn't want Emmitt Smith, who was dealing with a contract situation in Dallas, but the Dolphins didn't want him because of chemistry reasons. Cool, but both the Marx brothers were now gone, and worst of all, Dan Marino tore his Achilles 5 games into the season, and everyone thought that his career might be over. So, I don't know what else there is to say. They broke him. They really did. And he was recovered for the start of 1994, but at his age of 33, everyone was writing him off, and rightfully so. How much more carrying could he even do if he returned to vaguely his form from the year prior? Because Marino really was the offense. By this point, the lowest ranked DVOA offense the Dolphins have ever had under Dan Marino was 7th. Insanity. Once again, with a bottom 10 rushing attack every year, and the run game was just not getting better either. But to start the season, oh mama, did Dan Marino ball out. Opening game, first game back from injury, 500 yards and 5 tutties on the Patriots' head, and the only pick he threw went right through a dude's hands. And this Dolphins team wasn't the elite of the elite, but in 1994 they were just fun. They had the fake spike game, they took down Joe Montana and the Chiefs in the wild card, but then narrowly fell to the Chargers in the divisional round. And I know I just breezed past these playoffs, but it's the same thing, bro. Dan Marino, 260 yards, 3 touchdowns, no picks. Great game, right? Wow. Did they win? No, they didn't. Who was their leading rusher? Fucking Bernie Parmesan, who had 16. The team got outrushed 26 to 202. At this point, the electric chair must have been looking pretty yummy for Daniel, because dude just had 4,000 yards and 30 touchdowns, the most he's had since his 1986 season, and it's the same punchline every damn season. But there was still one more joke left to be told, one last gag that we've seen before, and it would be told a few times. As in 1995, did you know the Dolphins did not have a good defense? Or a good running back? Our boy Parmelli, or whatever, was back, and the Dolphins were a low B-tier team again. Marino was still good, but not a superstar at 34 now, and the team was simply lunch meat come playoff time again, as again, they went into the frigid tundra of Buffalo and got fucking curb stomped by the Buffalo Bills. And this score of 37-22 was not even remotely accurate. It was 27-0 in the 4th fucking quarter. Marino was bad, and they threw the ball 64 times, and hey, they ran for more rushing yards than usual. We gotta find some positives here. 70's not all-time bad. Oh. They, allowed the most rushing yards in a playoff game ever. That'll do it. This team's funny. See what I'm talking about here? This is why I made a video on this. I love stories like this, but somehow there's more torture. Because I'd say after 1995, Dan Marino was no longer a star quarterback. You could argue 96, he still had some juice, but afterwards his efficiency fell off a cliff. And you know what? In 1996, this is the funniest part, okay? He's out of his prime at this point, but in 96, for the first time in his career, they brought in Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, a good-ish running back, for a season, and he ran for 1,000 yards. And from 1983 to 1995, not only did Dan Marino not have a 1,000-yard rusher, but the Dolphins were the only non-expansion team to average less than 100 rushing yards per game during this time period. That is how you assemble a football team and build around an NFL legend, baby. Take notes, Cincy. Well, at this point, Don Shula had enough. He fell on his own sword and actually felt horrible about not being able to capture a ring with Marino. He said multiple times that this was by far his biggest regret, that he never won one with Dan. And Jimmy fucking Johnson sure as hell was not going to either. People were hyped up at the time about Miami hiring Jimmy, but it just never really worked out. He wanted to rely less on Marino. Fucking finally, glad they waited till the coke addiction kicked in with side effects, and his arm had less durability than my dick after a cold shower. And to his credit, like I said, this finally led to his first 1,000-yard rusher, but it was just too little, too late. They made it back to the playoffs in 1997, but whether it be Dan Marino being washed or him now not being able to call plays at the line of scrimmage anymore with Johnson, but the offense just seemed a bit non-Marino-y, even more than in recent years. So in 1997, when they did squeak into the playoffs at 9-7, with Marino still leading the league in completions at 36, pushing 37, but also, an underrated issue throughout his career was his receiving help too. He just didn't have talent outside of the Marx Brothers, and all respect to them, but even they weren't like Jerry Rice or James Lofton level dudes. You can argue James Lofton, but he didn't really get the amount of talent that his peers had to work around. And for the next 2 seasons, they were handed blowout losses in the playoffs. First in 97 by the Patriots, and then a shellacking at the hands of the Broncos, 38-3, after finally beating the Bills too. But that was the thing. The Bills were the laughingstock of football, and they were always putting belt to ass with the Dolphins. Even if they somehow beat the Bills in those early years, the Cowboys would have just steamed their ham even worse than they did with Buffalo. And now, it's time to talk about the season of 1999, the last in the Dan Marino era, and more specifically, the most humiliating game to ever be played. This one game is still being felt by Dolphins fans today, because the Dolphins in 1999 also, underratedly, had one of the worst fucking collapses ever. It was just like the football gods decided to unload all of their hatred at the Dolphins organization for fucking wasting Dan Marino, and Dan just so happened to get caught in the crossfire. At one point, the Dolphins were 7-1 and got pretty lucky to get there as Marino missed some time, but from there, instead of letting him rest, they rushed him back just in time to get embarrassed on Thanksgiving with 5 interceptions versus the Cowboys in a 0-20 loss. Okay, that's certainly a decision. He then went to return and go 1-5 to end the season, including that Cowboys game. But this is it. This is the last Dolphins playoff win with Marino. They were playing the Seahawks and were down. Marino was a shell of himself, but sometimes the all-time greats can get things done even with no gas left. And Dan gave the Dolphins one more drive, one more touchdown, and with a 20-17 lead late, they held on to beat Seattle. And then it happened. The horrors of what took place on January 15th of 2000 can only be summarized by the work of Lovecraft himself. For Miami fans, this was more than just a nightmare. This was hell incarnate. These fans rooted for Marino all his life. They watched his career get thrown in the trash, only for him to still harbor a large amount of blame, and in his last game, the football gods delivered a barrage of misery to the likes of which we will never see again. It's fucking poetry, man. 62 points. The Jacksonville Jaguars scored 62 points in an organized professional playoff game. Mark Brunell, the Jaguars quarterback, was pulled in the fucking second quarter to rest. In the early second quarter too, and Dan Marino was destroyed. He had just played the worst game of his career. Maybe not by the stats, but by what it meant. This meant he failed. He didn't win a Super Bowl. It was over. Still to this day, he says that game was the biggest embarrassment of his life, and afterwards, he retired from the NFL. Forever. He got offers from most notably the Vikings, but the knees and the motivation weren't there, and that was it. Dan Marino retired ringless. And just looking back for a second, I mean, the guy was amazing. In 10 of his 17 seasons, he had the best sack rate in the NFL, tied for the best ever at 3.13% for his career with Peyton Manning. Those two dudes, just the best to ever avoid sacks. Ignoring George Blanda, but he's his own anomaly. And his philosophy for throwing a football was also uniquely him. He believed that no matter how good a defense is, you can't defend a perfect pass. And you know, he's right. And he just said, fuck it. I'm going to throw a perfect pass better than anyone ever and more than anyone ever, and it won't matter how good a defense is. But throughout his entire career, on all his playoff losses, the Dolphins' defense allowed, on average, 34 points per game in these losses, with just 51 rushing yards per game. I mean, it should have been a crime to let that go on. This is not sustainable, and they took advantage of his greatness for almost 2 decades. And Marino also retired with like every passing record ever, like I said in the intro, having the most passing yards ever, most touchdowns ever, most completions ever, and it wasn't close too. I could keep going on, but I'm kind of making myself sad. Sports are cruel, man, and especially in this pre-free agency era Marino was put into. He was just trapped in Miami for the most part, but the NFL needed a player like him, or else we might never get to the point we are today. He earned the respect of everyone. He had the mindset, he had the talent, he had the intangibles to win a Super Bowl, and although people like Rod Woodson and millions of others, including his competitors, have always said that if he had a consistent, good defense and a run game, he'd have multiple rings. But that didn't happen, at least not in this reality, and instead, Dan Marino is known as easily the greatest quarterback to never win a Super Bowl and the greatest tragedy in NFL history. Anyways, if you like this video, then subscribe, because I got a lot of videos on the channel just like this one. And if you did like this video, watch this video I did a few weeks back on the entire history of the Raiders. It's pretty good, trust me. And thanks to all my Patreons for pledging tiers. It truly does mean a lot. But anyways, until next time.